Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us once again for another Tuesday Talk. Welcome to the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre's Tuesday Talks. My name is Natalie and I work at the Centre. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, wherever you're joining us tonight for How the Infant Brain Provides Insight into Human Spiritual Experience. Now, human beings are born biologically wired for social connection. Newborn infants pay attention to other people's facial expressions, tone of voice, and even the timings and patterns of communicative exchanges. In short, human beings are born already active participants in relationships. Can this innate capacity for connection help in making sense of human spiritual experience? This is the question Dr. Suzanne Zeedyk, research scientist and infant psychologist, will explore in this lecture. I won't say too much more, Suzanne, I'll let you get started. But in 2014, Suzanne broadened her public reach by founding the organization Connected Baby. She and her team work to help parents and professionals make practical use of the science of connection. Relationships matter as much for human brains as for human hearts. Hi, Suzanne, how are you?
Natalie, it is so lovely to be with you, and very few people pull up Connected Baby's description, and I'm just caught at the moment with human brains and human hearts, and that actually captures really well what I like talking about. So I'm delighted to be with all of you tonight to explore spirituality.
Well, we're delighted to have you. And how would you, just some very quick housekeeping. I will go ahead and mute you. We do ask that you stay muted during the talk. If you have any questions, pop them in the chat box and we'll get to them during the Q&A. Beautiful. Are you ready to get started, Suzanne?
I am delighted to have so many people here.
And we're wonderfully happy to have you too. Yeah.
Okay, shall I just go for it, Natalie?
I think just go for it.
Okay, then to do that, I'm going to pull up some PowerPoint slides to just really give us something to focus on and think about. But I will be absolutely delighted if, as I'm talking about these, reflecting on what the science is telling us, if lots of you do put questions in the chat box, because afterwards I will find it really interesting to know what you were being sparked to think about, because I'm going to cover quite a number of findings that we have about babies, which I think are fascinating. So if I had called tonight anything, in fact, this is what we called it when we sent out the publicity: how does the infant brain provide insight into human spiritual experience? And I'm going to jump immediately to the punchline. The answer is with connection. The infant's capacity to connect to others, I think, is quite profound. So in fact, if I played with titles a little bit and I thought about other words that I might use to talk about that idea, I might have called tonight this: what is the most profound thing about babies? And I think it is their capacity for connection. Or I might have called tonight this: what would the world be like if we honored our innate human capacity for connection? What would the world look like? I spend a lot of time thinking about that. So we could also have called tonight this: what does that Dr. Zeedyk think is fascinating? And the answer is human connection. I talk about it all the time, but tonight is unusual. It is unusual for me to get to think about spirituality through this lens. So I really am delighted to be here tonight. Now, you might be thinking, okay, tell me again how you got to this point in reflecting on these themes. Well, this is me after about 20 years at the University of Dundee. And I put a little arrow there to the window of my office, where I was a research scientist and academic. And part of the reason that I like reflecting on my backstory, which as you can see is 10 years old now from that date of 2011, which is when I took a kind of radical decision. I resigned from my post as an academic in order to try to reach the public. And I wanted to do that because I had got a bit frustrated that the information that I thought was so fascinating, by that point, I had begun to realize other people just really did not have access to it. Parents, nursery staff, teachers, doctors, politicians, police officers, people I thought deserved to know this. So in 2011, I took this decision to step away from full-time academic work to try to reach the public. And I often tell that story because it helps us to think about how do people get to know this information. I didn't have enough time to speak to the public when I had a full-time position at the university. So it helps to think, how do people learn what science has to teach us, which I do think is really fascinating. Now, I often tell that story, but I wanted to add a little tiny bit tonight because I realized that we're on something of the same time journey. Arthur Conan Doyle Center. For anybody who's here, I know a number of people here follow me. You may have no idea where the Arthur Conan Doyle Center is. This is it on Palmerston Place in Edinburgh. And as you can see from the website, first of all, it was opened in 2011. That means it's also your 10th birthday this year. And the center is a nonprofit charity with a mission to make spirituality accessible to everyone by providing a space for the community to nurture their physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. So that becomes interesting to think that that links with human brain development. But it does. And so these are the groups of people that I'm often asked to speak to. And I wanted to put that up tonight because it helps everyone who isn't one of my crowd who's here tonight to realize that if you have come with an interest in spirituality, then your interest is part of this discussion. Most of the people who talk about infant brains with me don't know they're talking about spirituality. So I think there's a really interesting overlap. And when I talk about this information, I forever come back to three key themes. The first is that babies arrive on this earth already connected. The second is that connection goes on to shape brain development, and that means that disconnection also shapes brain development. And finally, that society suffers when babies and when adults don't feel connected. And although I have talked about that for 10 years, there has never been a time when it is more applicable and perhaps people get it as well as they do now during COVID lockdown, because the thing that so many people are suffering from is disconnection. Okay, so when I talk to those themes, I often use the same words that are on the center's website. I talk about wellness. I often talk about mindfulness. I talk about music. And I talk about community. But can I keep stressing, no one has ever asked me to speak about spirituality before. So there is more to understanding the infant brain than even all of the people who are interested in it actually realize. So if tonight you want to talk about this on social media, it's one more way to get the word out. And I just wanted to pop this out. If you're on Twitter, I just wanted to be sure that you had both the Twitter accounts for tonight. And if you're saying anything on Twitter, it'd be lovely if you include people in, because I know there was quite a lot of discussion already earlier today. Okay, so this is what I thought I would talk about tonight. I can talk literally for days and days and days and days about this, because I do think it is fascinating and profound. So I thought that tonight I would just use my time to unpack this idea that babies arrive connected and really look in depth at what some of the science is telling us around that. And I hope that I have brought something that you too will find fascinating and may not have known. Okay. This is a 3-month-old baby and her mom. It was taken by my photographer on my team because we use lots of photographs to try to illustrate these ideas. And I love this photograph and use it quite a lot because we can see in it the intense connection going on between a baby and her mom in the midst of rough and tumble play. They've just been playing on the ground. There's lots of movement. And in all that movement, we can see here that the baby and mom have their eyes locked on each other. Now, 3-month-olds, their head is so heavy, they're just getting to the point where their neck muscles can hold up their head. And we can see all the work that this baby is putting into staying connected. She's got lots of effort going into her arms. She's got her head really far up. She's looking straight into her mom's eyes. You can see the connection between them. And if I just flash this photograph at people quickly, the interesting thing is they think they could also see the mom's face. But because I've left it up longer for you, you can see that you can't. Somehow we intuitively know what the mom's face looks like because we can see it reflected in the baby's face. That's what I mean by connection. This capacity to mirror each other, to reflect what another is feeling, and to stay in intense eye gaze is present in 3-month-old babies. But it's also present in babies that are 30 minutes old. This is Daniel, and this is his mom, Kelly, and Daniel was born during lockdown. Daniel is not yet a year old. And Kelly, I guess they got Daniel's permission. Kelly and Daniel's dad, Brian, took this photograph, and because they understand about the importance of connection, they were so excited they sent it to me. And in it, they had caught Daniel already in an intense gaze with his mama at 30 minutes old. Now here's the thing. Lots of people do not know that babies 30 minutes old are capable of connection, are capable of psychological engagement. This is news to a lot of people. And it is absolutely delightful to Brian and Kelly to see that in their son, Daniel. Here's another example. This picture was also taken by a family, and the baby's even younger. In this one, the baby's 10 minutes old. And in this one, the baby's in the arms of his grandmother. And I like this photograph because grandma is looking at us. She's not looking at the baby. And still, the baby comes expecting, wired for, anticipating connection with other human beings. So we can see that the baby has his eyes on grandma, even though grandma is looking at us. He can sustain her looking away for a bit and still carry the expectation that she is going to look back at him. How do I help people to really get this idea that human babies are born with the capacity for psychological, emotional, physiological, and if you want to add it to it because it makes lots of people uncomfortable, spiritual connection. Okay, now I want to flag this idea that connection, the connection we have just seen in all of those photographs, the way that the babies experience connection will go on to influence their biological development. The way relationships feel to babies will shape the way their brain develops and the way their body develops. I think this is fascinating. The way that you are treated becomes wired into your brain and your body. The way that other people respond to you don't respond to you, ignore you, pay attention to you, laugh with you, shout at you. We carry in our body and our brains the way other people have engaged with us from the moment we were born. There is something that feels profound in that to me. And although I'm not going to talk about this tonight, if you want to know more, there is a book, you can get it from the Connected Baby website, in which I try to help people to understand that science has taught us about this biological development on the basis of emotional experience. So I spend all my time now trying to help people to think about that. What does it mean? What would it tell us? How do we talk about it? And sometimes I think maybe the words aren't best, and maybe photographs aren't even best. Sometimes I think videos are best. So in this video, I want to show you a baby engaging. Now, it's not a fancy video. It's an old scratchy research video. It has no sound, and you can see that it's not even high definition footage. And yet, I think it gives us an insight into these ideas. So the big baby is the real baby sitting on her mom's lap, and the little baby in the corner is the baby's mirror reflection. And this baby is just over 2 months old. And you might think, why would you put a 2-month-old baby in front of the mirror? What sense will they make of what they're seeing? And that is exactly the question. What sense does a 2-month-old baby make of their mirror reflection? That's the question to ask yourself. Do you think the baby notices her mirror reflection? Do you think she's making some sort of sense of it? Is she having a conversation? Does she think it's a friend, or does she think, I don't know, it's a visual stimulus? How do you know what a baby thinks? That's what infant psychologists like me are forever obsessed by. How can you tell what's going on in a baby's brain? What kind of sense are they making of the world? And she does seem interested. She's having phone conversations. In a second, we're going to play a trick on the baby in order to help us to understand what's going on for her. We're going to put her mirror reflection back in time by a minute, because it's not actually a mirror, it's actually a fancy computer setup. And we can make her reflection go back in time by a minute so that she's out of sync with herself. And what we will be asking is, does she notice? How long will it take her to notice? How will we know if she has noticed? It becomes a really fascinating question. But right now, she's live. You can see that when her head tips forward, she's working to keep her eye on her friend. She's got an interested expression on her face. Back to tongue conversations. But now it's on replay. And the question is, do you think the baby has noticed? And if you do, how did you come to that conclusion? What kind of sense do you think the baby is making of this interaction? Because it is true, her behavior has changed. Can you see her sucking her cheeks in and out? That's a sign of anxiety. Now she's like going really harder with her head. Come on, we were doing this a minute ago, and now she's looking down. That baby never looked down in the previous clip. Big sigh. It's true, the baby's behavior seems to have changed in some way. So in a second, we're going to play another trick on the baby. We're going to put it back to live, and we're going to ask the same thing. Will the baby notice? How long will it take her to notice? How will we know if she's noticed? But right now, it's still on replay. She's sucking her cheeks in and out again. That's a sign of anxiety. And now it's back to live. Do you think the baby has noticed? What did the baby do to help you to think that she noticed? What kind of sense is she making out of this? Now, if we were all in a room together, I'm going to guess that there would have been a little ripple of laughter when the baby smiled. And in fact, I'm going to pause it right there on that lovely smile, while we can contemplate what we just saw. If you think the baby noticed the change when she was out of alignment and then when she came back into alignment, if you think she noticed that and you think she did that quickly, then you are saying something quite profound about human babies. That at just over 2 months old, a baby notices not just that someone is in front of her, but that she is noticing the rhythm of the exchange between herself and someone else. At 2 months old, her brain is clocking that and is interpreting in that in some way, is making meaning of that. Can I stress again? Many, many people have no idea that human babies this young could possibly have that capacity. And I talk about this all of the time. What I don't normally do is link it to spirituality. So, in order to frame this for tonight, I simply typed into Google, what is spirituality? In order to find a way of talking about this. And this is the very first site that came up in my Google search. So this is from the University of Minnesota. And you can see that they have said taking charge of your health and well-being, and they have linked that to spirituality. The same words that I use, health and well-being, and the same words that are on your website. And here it is. They describe it on their website as spirituality being a broad concept with room for many perspectives, but that in general, it includes a sense of connection to something bigger than ourselves. And it involves a search for meaning in life, typically. I have just used the word meaning to talk about the baby's experience of her engagement with her friend. We go on in this description. A spiritual experience may be seen as sacred or transcendent, or simply a deep sense of interconnectedness. What I'm asking in this talk is, does our capacity for connection to another human being at birth speak to our human experience of spirituality? In fact, if you really push that, you might ask, is that a core component of our spirituality? The fact that we already arrive connected with the capacity to connect to other people. I hope it's a stimulating, interesting question, because it is not the way that even when people are talking about spirituality, they often talk about this, because we don't often talk about babies when we're talking about spirituality. So let me unpack that a bit. Just how skilled are babies at connection when they're born? How do you make sense of that? What has science learned? Well, the big revolution in understanding that babies have this capacity came in the 1970s, maybe at the end of the 1960s. In other words, not before then. So in the 1970s, in developmental or infant psychology, there was an absolute explosion of the understanding of babies' capacities. And partly it came about because the technology, the video technology, had gotten sophisticated and cheap enough to let us to see details that we just really couldn't see very well before. And one of the key concepts that came up in the 1970s was inter-subjectivity. And so this drawing that you see in front of you was developed by a guy called Professor Colwyn Trevarthen, and it became really famous. And can I just skip ahead for a minute? This is Professor Colwyn Trevarthen. I love this picture of him because he's got such a big smile on. And I wanted to emphasize he too is in Edinburgh. He spent his career at the University of Edinburgh his whole life, although he originally comes from New Zealand. This man changed our understanding of babies' capacities. And he is incredibly highly regarded amongst the now thousands and tens of thousands of people who know his work. And this is part of his work. So inter-subjectivity is a philosophical term, and it means inter, between, subjects, so between two people. And what Colwyn and his colleagues were able to unpack and start to explain is that babies come into the world ready for communication and engagement with other people. And they use all of their senses to achieve that, all at the same time. So their brain can already integrate vision, auditory, hand movements, the movements of the hands, and all of that at the same time. So in other words, connection with other people is embedded in our physiology, is embedded in our sensory capacities. And that it's quite complex and sophisticated even at birth. Now it changes, it becomes richer as the baby develops over that first year and beyond. But the basic capacity for connection doesn't come later. Babies are born with it. I will keep saying it because I think it is true. There is something profound in that. And what is also profound is that understanding, although we have had it since the 1970s, has not become part of our culture and has not become part of the systems that support babies and families. And that goes back to my question, what would our world look like if we really understood this? Okay, so here's a more complicated version of that drawing that you just saw. And this comes directly from one of Colwyn's slides. So rather than intersubjectivity, here he has called it Syn Rhythmic Regulation, which is a word that no one would ever remember unless you were a geek over these things. And yet he is casting about trying to find words that help us to get this. And here's another attempt to explain what I just said. After birth, the mother and the baby communicate psychologically. They regulate sympathy between themselves by signs of emotion, and they do that musically. This rhythmic exchange is musical. It has a beat. It has a predictable escalation and a predictable dropping off of that rhythm. You can see here, he said that the emotions are exchanged at a syn rhythmic frontier, and that the baby is making sense of what the mother is doing, and the mother is making sense of what the baby is doing. And they pass expressions of the face, the voice, and the hands back and forth rhythmically, imagining each other, participating in feelings. And as he describes it here, the baby is ready for stories of conversation. Even on that slide, it feels almost like poetry. If Colwyn were here, he would say, yes, Suzanne, because that's where poetry comes from. That's where core human experiences come from. They come from our exchanges with other human beings. Babies arrive in the world already able to engage in these conversations, in these exchanges. What the 1970s taught us is that capacity does not develop sometime later in infancy. Babies, human beings, are born with it. I think this is profound. But the question is, how do you talk about it in a way that people get it, in a way that people can become curious about it, in a way that people can become curious about the experiences that they had as a baby. Because, of course, I'm not just talking about our babies or our children, I'm talking about us as babies and our parents as babies and all of the generations before us as babies. Remembering that I said that the exchanges that you have with other people go on to shape your brain and your body. So we carry we carry these exchanges that we had a time before we can even remember in our physiology. It's fascinating. Now, this slide from Colwyn's own work came from this presentation that he gave in 2017 at the Festival of Ideas. And I wanted to pull it up because we have more words now to go with this. He called that presentation on that occasion, "We Need to Belong." Finding one's personality and sharing life stories in a community. Community is the word that you have on your website, a website that talks about spirituality. So what if belonging, what if community, what if engagement is at the heart of the experience of spirituality? Okay. So I hope I've intrigued you a bit and I've started to drop this core idea into your head that human beings arrive already connected. What else have we learned that helps us to unpack that idea? Now, keeping in mind that the 1970s was a time of gigantic explosion and indeed argument amongst the psychologists, here's another discovery. This is Andy Meltzoff in 1977 with a black and white photograph of the studies that they were doing on infant imitation. And you can tell it's the 1970s because Andy Meltzoff has a very bad haircut. Although now maybe it looks a bit like a lockdown haircut for an awful lot of people. Okay, so Andy Meltzoff publishes the paper. And you can see there it's Meltzoff and Moore, just to give them credit. Andy Meltzoff published a study that caused such consternation that there was at least one scientific meeting in which a scientist walked off the stage because of the argument that they were having over their data. That's how big this finding was. Andy Meltzoff was able to show that babies as young as 3 days old would imitate facial expressions. So if you stick your tongue out at the baby will stick their tongue back out at you. Or if he opened his mouth, ah, the baby would imitate that facial expression. And indeed, the vowel sounds as well of ah. Or you could make this pursed lip movement. And this movement is so hard, it really takes effort to do that. This baby has gone cross-eyed in the midst of the effort of pursing his lips. Babies 3 days old. And then it turns out babies within minutes of birth will copy other people's facial expressions. Lots of people don't know babies can do that. And indeed, all babies can't do that. Partly babies can't do that because they might be asleep not long after they're born, or they might be withdrawing from drugs that their mother had been ingesting, or it might have been a really difficult birth. Some babies don't pay close enough attention. But an awful lot of babies do exactly this. If we have time and quiet and it's not too distracting, babies will engage with the facial expressions of other people and imitate them. Now, the big argument was it a reflex? Was it like if you hit your knee with your hand and your knee goes up? We call that a reflex. We don't normally think of it as a conversation. So one of the big arguments at the time was this a reflex? Or was it meaningful? Was it a conversation? And although sometimes the arguments still reign a bit, by and large, most scientists have come to the conclusion that this is a kind of conversation. The babies are born already making meaning of other people's movements facial expressions, gestures. It's almost as if the baby has sort of said, oh, right, I'm here now. Okay, you're sticking your tongue out at me. That must be how we say hello on this planet. Okay, hello, Andy. Mm. In other words, it is meaningful. So from the abstract of that paper, these are the words that were used. The imitation implies that human neonates can equate their own unseen behaviors with gestures they see others perform. Now here you can see, this says infants between 12 and 21 days of age, but what I've tried to capture with the illustration of one particular paper is the discovery that was quickly made that it went down from 12 days to 3 days to birth. Human neonates can equate their own unseen behaviors. They cannot see what their face is doing. They can match their behaviors with gestures they see others perform. That is what I call connection. Okay, so let's jump quite a few decades to 2005. People are still discovering things about infant imitation. This is a researcher named Imitation. You can see her there at the bottom. Imitation was at the University of Dundee with me. And what Imitation did was take the developments in the science of infant imitation and move it from the face to the hands. Because one of the criticisms of that work was that, yeah, but we shouldn't put too much emphasis on what babies do with their mouths, because babies' mouths are used for all sorts of things when they're that young. They need them to eat. We could mistake all of the mouth movements as meaning when maybe what they are is hungry or exploring aspects of the world like their fingers. So let's not put too much emphasis on facial expressions. So Amage did something unique. She said, okay, we'll see if babies can imitate with hands. And you can see that in this particular experiment, Amage is holding up 2 fingers. And in this case, we've got a set of twins, I think. And if I blow up that twin on the right, you can just see that the baby is imitating her. She has held up 2 fingers. Amage discovered that babies would have conversations with you holding up 1 finger, doing a turn-taking exchange of 1 finger, and then you could shift to 2 fingers and babies would shift the topic. And indeed, you could hold up 3 fingers. Babies can shift, imitate, change topic by following the rhythm and altering what they do with their hands in accord with what you do with yours. And once again, this was kind of stunning for people because the idea that babies could imitate with hand gestures as well as facial expressions is not how we typically think of babies. It's more complex than a lot of people imagine babies could be. And so when Amage talks about these, she is trying to really help us to understand that we have not conceived of babies in the complex fashion that fashion's not even a very good word, but in the complexity that human beings have at this really young age. Okay, here's another thing we've discovered. This is from a piece of research in 2013. In other words, I'm moving us closer and closer to our time. I'm trying to help us to understand that these debates are not simply in the past, but they are very much the conversations that infant psychologists are having today. So here's a piece from the Belfast Telegraph, which picked up a publication by a researcher named Vasu Reddy, and there she is. She's at the University of Portsmouth at the other end of the country. And you can see that they've given it the title, Babies Help Mothers Pick Them Up. And this is from that article. Professor Reddy has found that most babies aged 2 to 4 months old understand they are about to be picked up They can read minds, or at least bodies. They understand they are about to be picked up the moment their mothers come toward them with their arms outstretched, and they make their bodies go still and stiff in anticipation, which makes it easier for them to be picked up. Guys, this is amazing when you think about it. Literally, a 2-month-old baby is making sense of someone else's intentions. They are projecting themselves into the future, and they are coordinating themselves with that. When you describe it as intersubjective coordination, it's really complex. And if you want to see what that looks like, here is one of the videos from that work. There's no sound. The mother leans over. The baby's got her eyes on. She puts her hand out, and watch what the baby does. She prepares herself to be picked up. Because if the baby makes her body stiff, and I'll just play that again for you. If the baby makes her body stiff, it helps her mother to pick her up in a way as compared to if her body remains floppy. The baby has coordinated her intentions with those that she has read in the mother. It is highly sophisticated. Okay, and here's one more thing that the scientists discovered. In the 1990s, a guy named Vittorio Galisi, and here he is, in Italy, so we've now moved out of the UK, discovered mirror neurons. And there are massive discussions that go on about these now. But essentially what mirror neurons are is a confirmation that primates, and we're now trying to figure out more about how to discover them and how to research them in humans, that when I see you do something like lift your arm, neurons fire in my brain that are the same neurons as when I lift my arm. Can I try that again? I have neurons that fire in my brain that accord with my body movements, that fire also when your body does that. In other words, human beings are wired for connection all the way down to our neurons. That is profound. Here is how Galisi's language, here's how Galisi describes that. This is a summary of his work. That Galisi states that the mirror mechanism in humans is the neurophysiological substrate that underpins what he calls the simulatory process. You don't have to remember, these are big words. That's why I played at the beginning. What words do we use to describe this? Because most people are never going to remember anything like the embodied simulatory process. But here's the crucial bit. This process plays a basic role in mind reading. That's what we just saw the 2-month-old baby do. She read her mother's mind by what she watched in her body. Nobody told her to do that. That's what her brain is built to do. So with all of that in mind, can I get you to think about what it feels like in human relationships if you're doing lots of laughter? I hope in your households out there that you're laughing at that. I wish we were all together so that I could hear you laughing. Guys, I put this in because this video is making its way around Facebook at the moment. You can see that I put there at the bottom. I got it yesterday. Several people sent it to me and said, Suzanne, have you seen this? It's a brilliant video, but lots of people will look at it and think it's cute. It is cute. But it says something much deeper about the human capacity for connection. What happens when your experiences of other people are full of this kind of laughter? How is that influencing the baby's biology? How is that influencing the development of the baby's brain, the baby's body, when their exchanges with another person are like this? Most people watching this video will not have any idea that that is leaving biological and neurological traces on the baby's physiology, on their brain, on their body. We take it for granted. So, what's another way that I could help us to think about the consequences of connection and disconnection, and therefore how we experience the world? I want to show you another video in which psychologists have developed this procedure called the still face procedure, in which it disrupts the kind of interaction we've been talking about. And it is sometimes in the disruption that we see this capacity the best. If you don't respond to a baby, what kind of sense does the baby make of that? And we can start to think about, what is the baby learning about other people if this is not just an experiment, but is actually a lot of what happens in your life.
What we've learned over the years is that babies are much more capable than we initially imagined, but they're also much more vulnerable. And in Ed Tronick's still face experiment, we get to see both in a very short period. We see the baby and the dad playing together in their routines. There are things that they know about each other and things that they do together, and it's fun. And then we ask the dad to turn away, and when he turns back, to keep his face completely still and not respond to the baby. And the results are almost immediate, and they're devastating. The baby looks to the dad and tries to get the dad to get back into those games. Hey, we were just playing just a minute ago, weren't we? We were having fun. What's going on? And then the baby starts to get frustrated when that doesn't work. So she'll have to look away and look around the room and find something else, and then look back and say, now can we play? And within 3 minutes, the baby has really dissolved. She is trying to get out of the chair. She's uncomfortable. She's reaching out to dad. She's crying. And then we ask the dad to turn away again. And when he turns back, to go back to being regular dad. And it's a joyous reunion. They get back into their routines, the things that they do together, the things that they were just doing 3 minutes before. And the baby settles down and gets back to the comfort zone that she's developed with the dad. What we see in the still face experiment is how able the child is to initiate and be part of the relationship between the father and the child, but also how much she depends on that relationship in order to keep an even keel. And when she's grounded and comfortable, she can explore the world. She can meet new people. She can try new things. and she's got that safe base that she can always rely on. And there's a trust level there. We can only begin to imagine what it's like for babies whose life is like that 3 minutes all of the time. And they don't get that responsiveness, and they don't get any help getting back to an even keel. And the results can be very tragic. They can have trouble trusting people. They can have trouble relating to people. And they can have trouble being calm enough so that they can explore the world and take part in the world. So we know that those initial relationships, that initial responsiveness and interaction between the father and the baby, are keys to the baby's success as a child and as an adult.
Okay, guys. If it's key to development, what if it's also key to our experience of spirituality? So I popped this up before, but I wanted to come back to it. If spirituality is about a sense of connection, does that come out of our sense of connection to other people? Does our sense of connection to something bigger how does that sense of connection to something bigger, which many people think of as God, but many people will define in other ways, how does that relate to this human capacity for connection at birth? Because just before I start to wind up, so that we've got time for questions, I want to drop one more idea in here, which I think makes this really, really fascinating. That sense of connection doesn't come just at birth. What we are now learning is that that sense of connection starts even earlier. And I just want to give you a few flavors of that before I wind up for questions. There's a science called now fetal origins. And one of the best illustrations of that was written in a book by a woman named Annie Murphy Paul, and I popped this one up. This is the cover from the 2011, and I put that up because that was when the Arthur Conan Doyle Center was founded. So this happened at the same time that you were being founded. And you can see that the title is How the 9 Months Before Birth Shapes the Rest of Our Lives. Most of the time when people talk about all of this, they're talking about child development, physiological development, cognitive development. They're not talking about spirituality. But tonight, I'm just trying to help us to think about, so you already feel connected to the people in the world around you, even before you're born. Really? How do we know that? What does that mean? Well, that was big news when it came out, because this is the cover of Time in 2010. And you can see they've got, big letters, how the 9 months, how the first 9 months, how the 9 months before you're born shape the rest of your life. That's a really strong statement. And the point of it is that we now have lots of data that show that what you are learning while you are in the womb has an impact on what you expect of the world, how you relate to the world, and what you are born literally with your brain predicting and your body preparing for. I think it's a fantastic book, and it's one of my favorite TED Talks. So this is the image from her TED Talk that year. And can I just keep pointing out, that was in 2011 as well. What we learn before we're born. I used those ideas in a chapter that I wrote in a book that was published just at the end of last year called Scotland After the Virus. And I described it this way. I said, I'm simply trying to find a way to talk about the remarkable ways in which, as human beings, our present is woven from the strands of our past. I don't think we fully appreciate the connection between past and present. We tend to think of the past as a place. It's a place with edges and boundaries. It's a place we move on from. It's a place we think we can move on from precisely because we conceive of it as having been the past, as having boundaries. The past is a place we tell stories about because we don't live there anymore. Except what the science is telling us is that that's not true. The past still lives within us. Here's how science knows that. There was a fantastic study published in 1986 called the Cat in the Hat study. What they did in that study was that they played recordings of mothers reading The Cat in the Hat to babies when they were 3 days old. But the thing is, their mothers had literally read them The Cat in the Hat for the last 6 weeks of pregnancy. So they played them recordings of the mothers reading that, or recordings of the mother reading a different book like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And they recorded the babies sucking an electronic nipple. And you know what? Babies at 3 days old recognized the story that their mother read them when they were in the womb. They said this about that study. It is perhaps now common knowledge that babies are born with the ability to recognize their mother's voice. Maybe we know that in 2016, but in the early 80s when this study was published, that was not the case. This is part of the obituary for Tony DeCasper, who died in 2016. He helped us to understand that babies still in the womb are learning about the voices of the people around them. They know what the voice of their mother will sound like when they are born, or their father if he's there every day, or their gran or their granda, or their big sister or big brother. We know the voices of the people that will be in our world when we are born. We also know the music that will be part of our lives. So Peter Hepper in 2011 published a study about the music that babies heard, in particular the theme tunes from soap operas. They played the theme tunes from EastEnders or from Neighbors. And when that study made it into the Independent, what they had discovered was that if you had mothers watch EastEnders on a regular basis, on a daily basis, or Neighbors, that if you measure their heart rate, baby's heart rate responds differently to the music they have heard in the world around them. Nothing much had been known about fetal behavior. But in 2011, they were able to say, we have been able to prove that memory develops even before you are born. Music and voices are already coded in your brain before you are born. You bring them with you from your time in the womb. I think this is profound. And we are still making use of this. So this is from 2015. A study that was trying to think about this information for babies in the NICU unit, so premature babies. What they found is that if you play recordings of mothers' voices for even 3 hours a day, and perhaps recordings of other experiences, sounds that you would have in the womb, it changes the brain development of prematurely born babies who often struggle in their developmental course. Yes, this is the kind of study where you think, I can believe these results, that playing the sound of wombs to premature babies in the NICU unit, I can believe them because they fit well with what scientists now know about fetal brain development. This is not standard practice in NICU units. If it was, how would that change the development of babies? And how would it change our thinking about their experiences? And how also would it change support for domestic violence units? Because if your mother's singing or playing soap operas is recorded in your brain, so also if your parents fight. This is the uncomfortable side of this. And I appreciate you willing to even think about it. What it tells us is that babies are learning before they're born whether the people in the world laugh and sing or whether they fight and cry. You can arrive in the world already predicting that the world can be a scary place. That's how far back our expectations about the world and experiences of other people go, back to before we are born. So as I really start to wind down, this is another topic that Annie Murphy Paul talked about in that fantastic book. And in this case, she talked about some research that was done around the time that the Twin Towers collapsed, in which they found, and it made it into the papers. So this is The Guardian's in 2011. They found that women who had been in the midst of that attack, who had experienced it as particularly traumatic, that their babies had a different baseline of the hormone cortisol, which helps you to help you to cope with stress. In other words, the trauma that the mothers had experienced while the babies were still in the womb had changed the baby's physiology. Their trauma had been transmitted to the babies. It is profound. It's good science. It's also deeply uncomfortable. Developmental psychologists would ask, how do we talk about this in a way that doesn't make mothers feel anxious? Because this is hard to think about. And yet I think mothers deserve to know it, and fathers and families. And indeed, I just want to really bring a spot up today. This piece is from last week. And you can see that the title here is that psychologists track child psychopathology from before birth. And here's an excerpt from that piece. They're looking at the effects of prenatal and postnatal stress on child psychopathology, which means depression, anxiety, impulsivity. There will be many families who have struggled during COVID. And that will be changing the physiology even of some babies not yet born. How do we think about that as a society on the other side of COVID? That's what lots of people would ask in my presentations. But tonight we're here to talk about spirituality. So if you get this idea that even your experiences in the womb are influencing you, I want to end with two final ideas. If we summarized everything I have tried to say in this last half, where I'm talking about the womb, what if we took this piece from, 2011, that was entitled, Can the Fetus Sense Mother's Psychological State? And here's an excerpt from this piece, which I think captures what I've been trying to say. We believe that the human fetus is an active participant in its own development and is collecting information for life after birth. Prescient human fetuses thrive. The human fetus already feels that it is part of something bigger. It is part of something more than itself. It is part of connected to something else. Now, what words do I use for that? Because it's kind of hard to say. The human fetus feels, believes, thinks. It's all unconscious. And some people would say that I should not use that language, that I should talk only about the physiology of it, that I can only infer the experience. But that is what we're trying to do tonight. And so I think it's legitimate to try out that language that says human fetuses already at some level see themselves as connected to something bigger than them. And this is my final idea, my final point tonight. Of course they do. Because as soon as they start to become anything like conscious, they are developing in the world of their mother's heartbeat. Fetuses start to hear somewhere between the ages of 18 to 24 weeks old in the womb. And if we begin to think about what does a mother's heartbeat sound like in the womb, what is it like if I am developing with the mother's heartbeat around me ceaselessly, constantly, reassuringly present. What would that be like? And I'm going to end by playing that so that we can think about it. And I hope you might be wondering, what would the world be like if we honored this experience and therefore our innate human capacity for connection to something bigger than ourselves as communicated to a baby in the womb through their mother's heartbeat? Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. That was wonderful. Claps all around. I had no idea 2011 was such a big year for everybody. I don't know if you were watching everybody's faces as well, Suzanne, but during the videos, whenever we had a smiling baby, the smiles were contagious all around the screen. And when that baby cried, it was fantastic to see. We've got a couple questions already. I'm sure they'll keep coming in, but the first one is about twins, and we have another one about twins. Have you had any thoughts about any differences for twins or other multiple birth children? Possibly they have a greater connection inside the womb as they develop. Does that continue after birth?
Guys, I put in slides about twins and then I took them out because I thought we are not supposed to be here for 3 hours. We're supposed to stop after an hour and a half. Take that out. There's a great woman who wrote a book, a woman named Alessandra Piantelli. And she did a very in-depth study of twins' experiences in the womb. And the core insight that she found was that twins, and then you could extend that to other multiple births, but this was looking at twins. Twins in the womb together developed patterns of interaction, partly dependent on where they were in the womb. So that if you had like a twin that was on top of the other, that would be a different relationship than twins that are facing each other. So that shaped it. But the key thing was that they responded to each other. So she was able to show that one set of twins spent quite a lot of time feeling each other's faces through the sacs of their placentas. And their favorite game for years into their childhood, once they were born, was to be on either side of a curtain, feeling each other's faces through a gauze curtain. She talked about another set of twins that fought quite a lot. And those twins continued to fight quite a lot continuing those patterns. And the level of their conflict was really striking compared to the other twins that she had studied. So I'm just trying to give 2 examples of families that were in that study. And what she was trying to say is that the interaction patterns that she had found in the womb continued with those twins long after they were born. So that the interactions between children in the womb patterns begin before they're born and they carry them on. When people talk about the deep connection between twins and that some people try to explain, if you think about that going all the way back, literally to their experiences in the womb, it gives it a new kind of depth and complexity. So there's some really fascinating stuff that is out there for anybody who's interested in twin experience. Can I say one other thing? What we're able to see with twins is that they spend a lot of time feeling each other's faces. Singleton babies don't do that. But what we now know is that they spend quite a lot of time feeling their own faces, and really fascinatingly, they spend time feeling the walls of the womb. So babies in the womb are not just being, they're literally exploring their environment. In other words, they have some sense at some level that they are connected. They're not just floating in space. They're exploring their environment. So they have some sense of themselves in relation to something else. It is fascinating.
It's so sweet to think about as well. We have Kathleen who has a question. Are you there, Kathleen? Can we hear from you? Hi, Kathleen.
There.
You asked a question about some other studies that Dr. Zeedyk might have done.
Yes, I did. I was asking in response to babies who were born with either a birth defect, premature, which you did cover a bit of, and with severe illness, that are spending large amounts of time in a NICU unit, in an incubator, not being able to be held by their mothers. Do you have any studies that can kind of speak to that child?
Kathleen, it's a good question, and it's why I wanted to pop something in. A lot of what I've talked about tonight, I'm just touching on a teeny bit, but I was trying to cover lots of breadth. You're absolutely right. So babies, premature babies in the NICU unit, one, they're born early, so their physiology isn't fully developed. And that means that their sensory capacities, so things may be overwhelming to, loud sounds, bright lights. But the baby is learning about the world. That's how brains develop. So if we just think about what that's like for a baby to be assaulted sensorily, but also to not have what was familiar, the sound of the mother's heartbeat, the sound of the mother's voice present. So that means that what was familiar is no longer there. And add to that, guys, this is not comfortable, but it's true for lots of babies. So add to that the discomfort of the needles, of the medical treatments to keep the baby alive. That will be influencing their experience of the world. This is hard for parents to think about because parents didn't set out to have their babies in the NICU unit. Okay, so I think that if we know things like helping to make it familiar, playing recordings of the mother's heartbeat or the mother's voice, that will help with their development. I then think we should do that. I think that should be part of NICU practice. It is part of some NICU practice, but not part of others. Kangaroo care, where you put the baby on the chest and you keep the baby close, is increasingly a part of care, but it varies across NICU units. And so I'm just trying to I'm trying to highlight the difference in that practice and wonder, how could we help more units to know that? Babies come into the world connected. Connection helps babies to feel safe, and it's where they develop most healthily. How do we help everyone to understand that and think about what it means for professional practice? Sometimes parents are very stroppy and they know this stuff, and so they insist that they get to spend more time with their baby on their chest. Good for those parents, but it takes courage and effort to try to stand up against a system. So if we can get curious about why systems don't get this, and we've known a lot of this since the 1970s, what has stopped us from getting it? Kathleen, that was a long answer. Does it touch on some of the things you found yourselves wondering about, though?
My daughter was born with spina bifida.
Okay.
So she was a month and a half in the NICU unit, and went through several major surgeries. So I guess I find myself, after listening to your brilliant presentation, wondering about the trauma that she had, with those surgeries and the pain and the length of time away from me. It was a challenge, I will say. And she's 41. thank God she lives on her own. She's she's a miraculous child. She can walk after 9 major surgeries. So we're doing good with it. But I do sometimes wonder about the trauma she had to endure.
Okay, Kathleen, I love this question, and we are trying to do 2 things here tonight. So I'm trying to keep a foot in both camps, hoping that that's helpful to people. I'm trying to help us to think about infant development and the trauma that we carry in our bodies that comes through all sorts of sources, and it's hard for parents to think about this, and it's scary. So doing the kind of thinking that you're willing to do there, Kathleen, takes courage, and I commend that, because for some parents it's too scary to think about. It's too hard to think about that their baby experienced difficult things that they couldn't prevent and that sometimes they caused. So that is part of what I think is important for our culture to think about. And I'm grateful to anybody who feels able to think about that and who talks about it. On the other hand, tonight, we're also trying to think about spiritual experiences and what this speaks to in terms of spirituality. And so I can see that several people have said that that we choose. So Anita, you have suggested that perhaps as babies, we choose our experiences. In that case, it becomes interesting to if you have that view, do we choose those challenges to help in spiritual evolution? I know that will not fit for everyone who's here tonight, but for those who do take that view, if we understand that babyhood has more challenges than we have traditionally realized, it helps us to think about spiritual development in that way. And it's not just babies in NICU units who have traditionally had pain. Until not that long ago, we standardly caused baby boys all sorts of pain. And it was standard practice for how we dealt with penises, and we offered no anesthesia because we thought babies didn't feel pain. So that means that there are lots of men on this earth who are carrying the pain of a standard medical procedure that perhaps we wouldn't have done if we had understood that babies feel pain. So in other words, I can come up with lots and lots of examples of the way that this relates.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Well, there's a lot coming up in the comments as well. And we also have Alexander McCall Smith has a question.
Oh.
Where are you, Alex?
Thank you. Yes. Well, thank you so much for that fascinating talk. I was particularly interested in what you said about motor neurons, because that obviously has very considerable implications for systems of moral philosophy.
Yes.
That are founded on empathy. And we can hear David Hume and Adam Smith.
Yes.
If they were with us today, they would be nodding their heads in agreement with what you said. But I just wondered whether there's been any work done on the potentially plastic nature of that capacity to respond for the motor neurons because that seems to be could have profound implications for moral education. Can you increase the sensitivity of this form of responsiveness through any form of exercise practices? Has there been any work on that?
Basically, yes. You're absolutely right that mirror neurons may lie at the heart of moral development. Now, some people would resist describing it that way, and that's why I keep saying, that's why I keep playing with all this language. But how do we think about that? So that if what mirror neurons are doing is letting me feel connected to you at a physiological level, therein lies the birth of empathy.
Yes.
And in fact, if you don't see empathy being expressed by children when they're about 2 years old, very roughly, we should worry about that. Yes. So we should see babies, 2-year-olds, toddlers, noting that other people are in pain and either getting a distressed look on their face, looking for help, bringing them their own teddy, bringing them their own blankie. And you see that lots in 2-year-olds. If you don't see that, we should worry. Okay, so what can interfere with the capacity of babies to know other people's facial expressions, to feel safe in making bids? If relationships feel scary to you, if they don't feel safe, then you will be having to be coping with anxiety in the midst of engagement, which interferes, changes children's development. And although to my knowledge, there hasn't been work done yet directly on the impacts of mirror neurons, because they're actually hard to study. They're studied in primates by literally inserting monitors into the neurons in the brain. And that carries implications for how you study them in human beings. The theory, you can transfer what we know about children's development and come up with theoretical predictions about how that might impact on the development of mirror neurons and therefore moral capacity. So let me try that in another way. One more time. In some of my last slides, they use the words the development of psychopathology. The roots of psychopathology probably lie often in early childhood. So if I said something what I hope feels a bit controversial and pushy tonight, Donald Trump had some experiences early in childhood that are now documented that may well have had an impact on his development, and I believe that they did, and therefore I believe had an impact on his moral development. Now, some people would say you shouldn't talk about people that you've never met, and that's a bit personal, but the consequences of Donald Trump's moral capacity has had massive implications for the whole of our world. Therefore, I think that really thinking about these capacities in young children and the development of moral capacities as a developmental process actually is really important for thinking about the kind of care that young children need and the kind of support that families need, and perhaps our spiritual development as well. Does that speak to some of what you're asking, Alexander?
It does indeed. I think that's absolutely right. One final, very quick observation. It would explain also possibly the psychopathic personality, for example, all of those personality disorders that we worry about so much. Psychopaths possibly aren't having that mirror neuron activity, the empathy isn't there. So, and it has massive implications for theories of responsibility as well. I think it's fascinating. Thank you very much indeed.
You are absolutely right. And if I just go back, you can hear the excitement in my voice, because I think these things are fascinating and important and profound. If psychopathy, part of psychopathy is that you don't feel other people's pain. Yep. That you don't connect with other people's experiences. And if that lies in human development, if that lies in the early years and perhaps even pre-birth,
yes,
then the implications are indeed profound. And it means that we need systems that support families. It doesn't mean that you're stuck with that developmental path. That's the point of a developmental path. There are things that we could do to help. Yes. But there are also things that we can do that make it worse. And we often do those things without ever realizing that we were doing them, either as systems or as individual parents. And therefore, that's why I think everybody deserves to know about this. And I'm delighted that you're asking about that with a moral frame to it. Alexander, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. And I think we have one last quick question, just tracing ourselves back to the spirituality, asked by Pauline. Would you like to come online and ask that question, Pauline? Are you there?
Sure. Hi, Suzanne. It was more just when at the end there, when you were talking about the sort of new evidence that's emerged from fetuses that have gone through, the mothers have gone through traumatic experiences, that's gathered on through life. And just, I wondered if like maybe different forms of therapies like past life regression therapy, that kind of thing, might be a useful sort of source of knowledge to draw from to try and tackle some of those kind of issues. I noticed that there are a few people in the chat, Tanya and Armando, to everyone, they talk about holotropic breath work. There's a few other people who've mentioned some other things. So this is not an area that I'm familiar with, but it was just something that struck me when you were speaking.
Pauline, yes, okay. Not everyone here tonight will believe that past life regression therapy is a thing or that it works. Or maybe people here tonight will believe that, but there will be lots of people who are not here tonight who will think that that's, there are lots of people who are not here who will think that that's a crazy idea.
Yeah.
So let me frame it this way. I think that if we understand how crucial the early years are, I think that if we understand how complex human babies' capacities are, human beings' capacities are, that complexity exists even before birth. If we simply understand that, then we can do all sorts of useful, helpful things with that. So if past life regression therapy is not your thing, fine. What is that would be helpful? If past life regression therapy is your thing and you can bring that to a way that helps people to let go of the trauma that is in their bodies, then that serves the world. The key thing is that most people just don't know this stuff. They don't know that we carry our past within our bodies. We don't know that we carry the past of our parents and our grandparents within our bodies. In fact, one of the pieces of research that I talked about tonight from the consequences of the Twin Towers is that that's likely to be passed on for at least 3 generations because of epigenetic changes, because of the trauma that the mothers experienced and then had an impact on the baby. So we carry the trauma not just of ourselves, but of the people before us, the generations before us. We carry that in our body. It is possible to release that from our bodies, but lots of people don't know that. They don't know how to do it. They don't know how to find somebody to help them to do that. And therefore they live with it in ways that they didn't have to, and they cause harm to other people. And so I think whether you see this through a spiritual lens or not, and I'm perfectly happy for people to see it through a spiritual lens, and that's what all of you have come along for. If we just understand this one basic idea, human beings arrive connected. It starts before birth. It changes the way we see the world and the way we understand ourselves. It is at the heart of our humanity and the meaning that we make of ourselves in this world. And if we understood that, we would create a different world, because the way we see ourselves in relation to it would change. And I just have hope that the more that we understand about babies and people talking about it gives us a chance of doing that before we destroy the planet that we live on, because we don't have a strong enough sense of connection to it. Soapbox over.
Yeah, that seems to be the big theme of our talks, that we always end up back at the planet, and that we're connected to it in a massive way. And all psychology, philosophy, and the environment all seems to be all coming into this new sort of hopefully paradigm shift of the way that we're looking at ourselves in relation to the world.
It's really interesting. I personally, I'm perfectly happy for anyone to see this as spiritual. I'm also happy to accept that not everyone will see it as spiritual. What I want is for us to find a frame that honors the connection that we are born with and that we have as a species, take responsibility for that and do creative things with that. And also to understand that that some of the times the reasons people don't do that is that literally they don't carry the same experiences in their body because often of early years experiences, and to find ways to work with that. So I remain very hopeful, but I also take it really seriously because our systems often aren't set up to help with this. And I spend a lot of time thinking about how can we create systems and a society that would help us to do that. which is why I'm delighted that all of you are here tonight, because you brought your curiosity. However you see it, you have brought your curiosity, and curiosity is the start of this. Without curiosity, we've no hope.
Thanks, Suzanne.
Thank you, Suzanne. And we've just hit 9 p.m. I think, Lance, would you like to come on and say a few words?
Oh, well, as chairman of the ACDC, as I call it jokingly, I'd like to say thank you very much. That was an absolutely wonderful talk. And I love the fact that, as Pauline's just said, different aspects of modern thinking are moving together, it seems to me, in a slightly more optimistic direction, in spite of all. I feel a change from when I was younger. This sort of thing would perhaps have been very strange 50 years ago, and it's not strange. It's absolutely wonderful. And thank you, everybody, for coming. And thank you, Suzanne. And I sincerely hope we'll be seeing you again.
A delight to be with you. Honestly, so interesting.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Good night, everybody. And a little applause, perhaps, if we can silently applaud.
All of you.
There are a few questions for you, Suzanne, in the chat, some experiences. If you want to get in contact with her, you can find her on suzannezeedyk.com. And we'll see you all next week. Thank you, Suzanne.
The pleasure. The notes are available for anyone who wants them. I'm happy to distribute them. Have a great evening and a great week.
You too. Bye, everyone, and bye.
Bye, all. Thanks, Natalie.